My name is Lou Lombardo, and I'm a retired professor from Old Dominion University. And in the picture on the both on the flyer and on the PowerPoint, I'm with my colleague there, Dr. Karen Polanco. She passed away in 2016, and she was the person who really got me starting to focus. Together, we worked for almost 30 years on violence and children, and especially on corporal punishment. So I always include her in my presentations on these issues because she's so influential. Globally, we did a lot of travel, a lot of research and writing and presenting at international conferences. So she's always there. So that's part of it. And I got my beginnings actually teaching in a prison. So if there was a place where control was emphasized, and it's interesting that prisons, at least in New York State where I am, in the 1800s, they abolished corporal punishment of prisoners as a form of punishment. So criminal prisoners couldn't be beaten, but we still do that to children. And I also put in the chat a few articles that Karen and I did on law. One was related to, we did an international study of law reform globally and tried to get some measure of it, and then tried to get a measure of child maltreatment. And what we found is in those countries where corporal punishment, both in family and in schools, globally in a sense, was banned, they had lower rates of child maltreatment based on a survey that UNICEF had done globally in a number of countries. So we tried to figure out how to do that. And we also got to present that information to the UN Committee on the Rights of Children, which in Geneva, who saw that research. And there's another article dealing with the comparison between human rights law and corporal punishment and US law and corporal punishment. Because remember, the United States is the only country that hasn't ratified the CRC. So we're in kind of a personal, as a country, in a very different situation than most countries. We don't even have the CRC to rely on or to go to as a source of values and possible legislation, because it's not part of our code. We haven't ratified it. But what I want to talk about today is something that has been, in a sense, talked about in many ways in the presentations that went earlier. Someone mentioned early on about the generational change and generations in corporal punishment. And people mentioned being whole as an adult, had to be whole and together in order to do that, and having manifestos that would be statements of principles, or the inherited baggage that adults have that they bring to how they deal with children. And same thing with teachers. And that alignment of mind, body, soul, bringing all that together. That's kind of what, in part, my presentation is about, and helping us do. And I'm trying to connect with what we do as children and what we did as children. One of the things I think that's important, and this comes out of, these are kind of some major themes that come out of the teaching that I do in a course that's called Violence in the World of Children, which covers everything from violence in the family, violence in schools, which could be bullying or teachers. It could be violence in the community, neighborhoods. It could be children in war. All of that is part of violence in children, child labor, child sexual abuse, child exploitation. And the thing that we need to remember is all of these forms of exploitation, all of these forms of violence are mainly committed by adults. The structure of the world is done by adults, not children. Children are living in a world that adults structure around them. And so we need to kind of get adults in touch with something that they often forget, and that is their childhood. Because when they turn a certain age, people tend to forget their childhoods. They don't want to think about their childhoods, they're adults. What we try to bring to my teaching, and what Karen and I have talked about often, was childhood is an intergenerational experience. So if you're dealing with today's children, that's these children, you're an adult dealing with today's children, you're bringing your childhood as an adult to your interactions with children that you're dealing with today. So those children are getting the effects of what happened to you as an adult. So it's passing on those generational characteristics. So the childhoods of today's children, I mean, today's adults are important. The childhoods of today's children with whom today's adults interact in the present. And what are children learning? They're learning the templates that they're going to then use when they become adults and pass those on to children. So that affects the future. So if we look at childhood as not just something that's part of a child in today's world, but part of this generational and intergenerational transfer process, it makes childhood seem a little bit more important than we normally think of it. And I want to ask you a couple of questions just to kind of get us thinking here that I ask in my class all the time. How many people that are participating today were children? Raise your hand. My guess is everybody raises their hands, okay? You can't get out of it. You were a child. You experienced what a child experiences. Keep that in front of you all the time, because if you do that, you're going to see the world of children in today's world very differently. Second question, which was the longer period of your life, or which is the longer period of your life, your childhood or your adulthood? Okay. My guess is most people, when I ask that question, and one of my students, we had a little Zoom meeting with my class the other night, and she says she's asking all of her friends that question. Every single one of them says adulthood. Well, that's a telling answer. That's an answer that illustrates something that's very important. It illustrates that people are taking basically what they call an adult-centered view. Okay, so we're getting, and what I'm trying to do is gaining a child-centered perspective. Well, if you take an adult-centered perspective, if you look at this little chart, it basically looks like this. Childhood goes on, it reaches a point, whatever, however you define that point. When it ends, when you move out of your parents' home, when you get married, when you get a car, when you go to college, when you turn 18, whatever social marker of adulthood is, you're now an adult, and that childhood stops. You're thinking that childhood has kind of gone away. Now, that adult-centered perspective, if you look over at this little block here, adults forget their childhood. They think that they're okay. They think that nothing that happened in their childhood now is affecting them. They see children as resilient. The children are just going to bounce back from anything when they become adults, and automatically the world looks much better. It's different. And hitting and humiliating children is okay. Adults don't want to feel the powerlessness that they felt as children, and they need the power to control. So this first perspective, the adult-centered perspective, you can see how that supports the way we view children and disconnects us from our own childhoods. However, a child-centered perspective understands, and if you see, remember the research that Stacy presented, all those things that affect children. It's not only affecting children, it affects the adults the children become. So if we look at this as the multi-generational perspective, you can see how important childhood becomes. So a child-centered perspective, adults remember their childhoods. If it's a case of hitting, they understand how hitting affected them. They think that children are malleable, that is, they're shapeable by their environments. They're not simply resilient, and anything we do to them, they can bounce back from. And humiliating children is okay. And the need to empower children, not take power away from children, is a central component of the child-centered perspective. So that becomes, as somebody was talking about, what are the goals of parenting? Well, one of them is to empower children. Empower the people that you're with, not control them so that they make no decisions for themselves. They have no input, they have no status, they have nothing, until automatically when they turn a certain age, now they're going to be able to do everything. Well, it doesn't work that way, unfortunately. Okay, now, whoop. Let me get my next one here. Okay, one of the things that children are going to do when they experience violence or child maltreatment in one form or another. And we have kind of in my class, we develop a working definition of violence in the lives of children. And our definition is not for, in a sense, science, social science measurement. It's not a legal definition. It's a definition that might have some power in terms of developing prevention strategies and doing more positive things in the lives of children. And our definition that we work with in our class is whatever impedes children's work is violence in the lives of children. Okay, as I said, this isn't a legal definition. That's a whole nother story. And as was just said, legal definitions are fuzzy. What constitutes excessive? There are many court cases in the US and other places where, a parent sees some marks on their child that maybe their spouse did. They think it might be abusive and they call Child Protective Services. Child Protective Services come out, see the effects of it. It says, oh, that constitutes, in my mind, that might be abuse, so we have to fill out a form. They do the report, they do the investigation, it goes to a supervisor. The supervisor says, oh, I think it is too. It goes to a court, they say it is. It goes to an appeals court, they say it isn't. So is it or isn't it? It is at some points, it isn't at others. So the legal definitions get us in a lot of trouble. They don't really solve the problem, they just magnify the confusion. But if we look at what children are doing, and we look at children as children's work, that's not child labor, that's what the children do in the course of their lives in terms of their development and their growth. What are they trying to look for? What are they trying to do? And we know most children, they're looking to contribute something to somebody else. It's not that they're selfish, but they want to help, they want to give. You see almost every study that does little children, they have something, they want to give it to somebody else. They want to share what they're doing. They're looking to connect with others. They're looking to empower themselves and to empower others. They're looking for self-confidence. They want to be in touch with their feelings and their emotions. They're looking for be able to use empathy and be enlightened witnesses for other people. But when you have to cope with child maltreatment, or you're coping with violence, whatever the source of violence, what happens? You start looking for threats because you want to protect yourself. You disconnect from other people because you're facing this violence is there. You feel powerless. So the things that you want to do, you're doing the opposite because you have to cope with child maltreatment. You begin to have self-doubt. You look at numbing of yourself. You don't feel the pain. You don't feel for others. You lack empathy and so forth. Let me get this out of the way here. Now you see this also works in the intergenerational transmission. As this child who's coping this way becomes an adult, what happens? Well, they're looking for threats as children, and when they become adult, who becomes the threat? The child. This is one of the things that I had a very difficult time figuring out. I was teaching a course on understanding violence, which looked at suicide, and violence against children, violence against women, hate violence, police violence, prison violence, war, all kinds of violence. And I could never figure out how children became the other, how children became the enemy for an adult. But this kind of showed me. Adults, after they cope with violence as children, are now disconnected from their own childhood. They need power to control and need to accept. So what we need to do is to get adults to start to recognize these things in themselves. Well, let me go back up here. Oh, here's the same slide but with a little different emphasis. We've got children's work here. These are the things we talked about before. We have how children cope with child maltreatment and violence. And there's also something else I wanted to add here, and this is the positive stuff, developmental assets. That is relationships that children have that are positive in their families, schools, communities, and external ones, and also the personal ones, the social, emotional, you were talking about the whole alignment of the whole person. Well, the problem is, even if there are positive things in a child's life, often because they have to cope with the negative things that are in their life, the effects of these positive things are less than they would be if they didn't have to cope with that. So children's work, coping with violence and maltreatment, undermines the positive side of children's life. Okay, now here's just one response from a student in my class as she's going through this first part of the course on developing a child-centered perspective. She said, I felt that my mother was always yelling at me when at times I did not call for it, and my dignity was violated. I have my own 2 children now, and at times I catch myself answering my children in a way that my mother did. But then she says, but now after looking at this class, after taking this class and learning about the child perspective, I'm always thinking on their level, which in turn helped me respond in that way. So now she's more in tune with her own children because she got in tune with herself. As somebody mentioned earlier, they were talking about being whole. They're now more connected to their own childhoods, and in that way, they can now connect to their own children better. And to me, that's kind of one of the ultimate prevention strategies, getting adults to connect to their own childhoods. Well, what's the manifesto? You talked about a manifesto that how you're going to treat children. And we talked some about the Bible, and we talked about the, the 4th commandment, at least in some tradition, says, honor thy father and thy mother. Well, I wrote a review of a book by Alice Miller called The Body Never Lies. And in that book, she looks at that. She says it's, how much trouble that commandment has caused, because people who were abused by their parents or hurt by their parents and harmed by their parents in incredible ways still love their parents. They have to love their parents, or else they feel guilty because they're violating that commandment that says, honor thy father and thy mother. Well, I wrote a little story about that and said, well, what if this isn't true? Don't say that this really happened. But I said, what if this were true? And generations ago, when Moses got the commandments, right, on Mount Sinai, and he comes down and he sees all the bad things and he throws them and they break, the first edition, right? The first printing of the commandments broke. And this piece got lost. And we went back and got the second set, the second edition, he comes out, and this was missing. But somebody found this. There's a monastery right near Mount Sinai called St. Catherine's. This is true. There's a monastery there that goes back to like 500 AD. I mean, it's very, very old. And I wrote this story where they found this piece of the tablet. They translated it. And what did it say? And now again, think, what if this were true? If the only thing we didn't go by was the made up spare the rod, spoil the child, or honor thy father and thy mother. But it said, parents should, in part, this is part B, part A was honor thy father and thy mother, which really applies to older children and their adult parents, as we as adults now treat our parents. But that's another story. But the lost commandment said parents should honor and empower their children so they, their children, and their children's children will live their own true, sober, long, and authentic lives. That's what you were talking about in terms of, that whole child. That's what you were talking about in terms of the parent, the adult being whole. But you're looking for this in your child. Your child might be different than you. It's okay, because your child is different. So if this were the case, would we be hitting children? Would we be, neglecting children? Would we be forcing children to become child soldiers? Would we be using child labor? Would we be doing sexual abuse? If this was the goal of what parents should be doing, that somehow, was gone from us because it was lost. Think how for the last 2,000 to 3,000 years, the world could be different if we treated children in this way. So that's the end of my presentation, and I'll be happy to any questions as we get to the end. So thank you. I'm so happy that we're doing this, and Abraham, you did a wonderful job. Thank you.